70 million Americans. Stop and hold that number for a second. 70 million people. That is more than the entire population of France, more than the entire population of the United Kingdom. 1 in every 4 or 5 Americans alive today believes the same thing about their family. They believe they have Cherokee ancestry, not vaguely Native American, not broadly indigenous, not some kind of tribal blood from way back, specifically Cherokee, specifically that one tribe, specifically that great-great-grandmother, always a grandmother, never a grandfather, who was, according to the family story, a Cherokee princess. Now here is the problem. The Cherokee Nation today has approximately 400,000 enrolled citizens. At the absolute peak of their population before European contact, historians estimate the entire Cherokee people numbered somewhere between 25,000 and 60,000 individuals, every man, woman, and child, the whole nation. Do the math. Even if every single Cherokee person alive in 1700 had survived, even if they had all had children, and those children had all had children, and so on down through every generation to today, the numbers do not produce 70 million Americans with Cherokee blood. The arithmetic is simply impossible. Something else is happening here, and when genetic science finally went looking for the answer, what it found was not a simple mistake. It was not a case of confused family trees and foggy memories. What it found was a window into the deepest, strangest parts of the American identity. A story about who Americans think they are, why they need to be that, and what happens when the DNA results come back and say something completely different. This is that story. Let's start at the beginning. Not with the DNA, with the legend itself. Because before you can understand why the science matters, you have to understand why this particular story exists in the first place. Why Cherokee? Why a princess? Why always a great-great-grandmother? Why does this legend follow the same script in families across Georgia, Ohio, Texas, and Oregon? This is not random, and researchers noticed that a long time ago. The Cherokee were not just any Native American nation. By the early 1800s, they had become the most visible, the most discussed, the most written about indigenous people in America. They had a written language, not borrowed, not adapted, invented, created entirely by one man. His name was Sequoyah, and in the early 1800s, he did something that almost no individual in human history has ever done. He looked at his people's spoken language, a language with no written form, and he built an entire writing system for it from scratch. Alone, no committee, no university, no government funding, just one man and an idea. Within a few years, a majority of Cherokee people were literate. They had newspapers. They had a written constitution. They had a functioning government with elected representatives. They built schools. They built courts. The American press of the time called them one of the 5 civilized tribes, a phrase we no longer use because the implication is obvious and ugly. But the point is that the Cherokee were everywhere in the national conversation. They were admired. They were debated. They were romanticized. And then, in 1838 and 1839, they were destroyed. Or so the story went. The United States government, under President Andrew Jackson and then President Martin Van Buren, ordered the forced removal of the Cherokee people from their homelands, from Georgia, from North Carolina, from Tennessee, from Alabama. The military came, the people were rounded up, they were marched west, more than 1,000 miles, to what is now Oklahoma, in the middle of winter, with inadequate food, with inadequate shelter. Thousands of people died on that march, children, elders. Pregnant women, the Cherokee called it Nunadal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. History calls it the Trail of Tears. The event was covered in newspapers across the country. It was mourned, it was debated, it was condemned by some and defended by others. And over time, like all great tragedies in the American imagination, it was mythologized. The myth said the Cherokee were gone. The myth said they had been destroyed, absorbed, dissolved into the American population. That they had vanished like smoke. That they were a noble, tragic, finished people. The myth made them safe to claim, because when something is believed to be extinct, when everyone assumes a people have disappeared, it becomes very easy for other people to say, "They live on in me." And so the legend was born. The Cherokee princess legend follows a pattern so consistent that researchers gave it a name decades ago. The ancestor is almost always a woman, almost never a man, a great-great-grandmother usually, sometimes a great-grandmother, far back enough that nobody alive can actually remember her, but close enough that the family feels the connection is personal and real. She is almost always described as a princess, which is a fascinating detail. Because the Cherokee did not have princesses, there was no hereditary royalty in the European sense. No crown passed from mother to daughter. The title is borrowed from European fairy tales and applied to a society that had no equivalent concept. She is almost always described as having high cheekbones. That phrase appears in so many of these family stories that it has become almost a verbal tic. High cheekbones, dark hair, a certain look, a certain bearing, and she is almost always conveniently beyond living memory, close enough to feel real, far enough away that nobody can contradict the story. Folklorists and historians noticed this pattern and began calling it the Cherokee princess myth. It appears in family trees across the American South, the Midwest, and Appalachia. It crosses racial lines. White families carry it, black families carry it, families who have been in America for 200 years carry it. The details are always the same. The structure is always the same. It functions less like a personal memory and more like a cultural template. A story that Americans reach for when they need to explain something about themselves. But what exactly are they explaining? In the year 2000, something changed. Direct-to-consumer DNA testing became commercially available. At first, it was expensive and slow, but by the middle of the 2000s, companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA had made it cheap and fast. By the 2010s, tens of millions of Americans had spit into a tube, sealed it in a box, dropped it in the mail, and waited for the results. And millions of those people were testing specifically because of the family legend. Because grandmother had always said Cherokee. Because the story had been passed down through 3 generations. Because they wanted to see it confirmed. They wanted the test to come back and say, yes, there it is, the Cherokee blood, right there in your genes, proof that the family story is true. The results were not what they expected. Across study after study, across hundreds of thousands of individual tests, the number of people who carried the Cherokee princess legend and also showed detectable indigenous American DNA was remarkably, shockingly small. One major analysis found that fewer than 5% of Americans who believed they had Native American ancestry showed any statistically significant indigenous American genetic markers at all. 5%, out of 70 million people. The princess was not in the data, and this is where the story stops being simple. Because if this were just a matter of people being wrong about their family history, confused memories, garbled genealogies, honest mistakes, you would expect the errors to be random. You would expect people to misremember a German ancestor as French, an Irish ancestor as Scottish. You would not expect millions of people, across multiple generations, across different racial backgrounds, across thousands of miles of geography, to all converge on the exact same story. The same ancestor, the same tribe, the same details. That does not happen by accident. Something is driving this, something underneath the family stories, underneath the DNA tests, underneath the legend of the Cherokee princess. Something deeper and stranger and more revealing about this country than anyone expected to find. 3 different theories have emerged to explain the 70 million. And each one of them, in its own way, tells you something uncomfortable and important about American history, about American identity, and about what people do when they need a story to explain who they are. Let's be honest about something. When millions of people share the same story and the data says the story isn't true, the comfortable explanation is simple. People are just wrong. Memories get fuzzy, details get added, stories grow in the retelling. That's human nature. Nothing sinister, nothing complicated, just the ordinary drift of family folklore over generations. But that explanation has a problem. Random errors don't look like this. When people misremember family history randomly, you get noise. You get scattered mistakes pointing in 100 different directions. You get ancestors who were German remembered as Dutch. You get Irish ancestors remembered as Scottish. You get confusion, yes, but not convergence. Not millions of separate families in separate states across separate centuries, all landing on the same specific story with the same specific details. That kind of convergence has a cause. Researchers identified 3 separate causes, 3 theories. Each one explains a piece of the 70 million. And when you lay them side by side, what you see is not a simple mystery. What you see is a map of American history that nobody ever put on a classroom wall. The first theory, the uncomfortable one. Historians who study American genealogy and race have a term for what they found in Southern family trees. They call it genealogical laundering. It works like this. In the American South, for most of American history, racial classification was not just a social category. It was a legal one. It determined what schools you could attend, what jobs you could hold, who you could legally marry, what neighborhoods you could live in. In some states, it determined whether you could vote, own property, or testify in court. And the line between racial categories was drawn in blood. Literally. One drop of African ancestry, by the laws of some states, made a person legally black, regardless of how they looked, or how they lived, or how their neighbors saw them. In that context, family stories mattered enormously. The story your family told about itself could shape the entire trajectory of your life. And the story your family told about a mixed-race ancestor, one with dark features, dark hair, something that didn't quite fit the expected appearance of a white family, that story had consequences. Here is what historians found. In the American South, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was significant mixing between white settlers, enslaved African people, and free black communities. This happened everywhere. It was common. It was sometimes coerced, sometimes consensual, almost always unacknowledged. When those mixed-race ancestors appeared in a family line, when a child was born with features that required some explanation, families needed a story. And the story that worked, the story that was socially acceptable, the story that carried no legal penalty and in fact carried a certain romance, was Cherokee blood. Cherokee ancestry, in the mythology of the time, was noble, tragic, poetic. It explained dark features without invoking the racial categories that carried legal and social consequences. It was, in the language of the era, a safe explanation. African ancestry was not safe. In that same era, in that same legal framework, African ancestry was dangerous. So families chose the safe story, and geneticists, when they tested descendants of families carrying the Cherokee princess legend, found something striking. In a significant number of cases, the DNA showed substantial West African genetic markers, and no indigenous American markers. None of the East Asian or Siberian ancestry that entered the Americas tens of thousands of years ago through migrations across the Bering Land Bridge, ancestry that is distinct enough and old enough to identify with high confidence. The Cherokee princess, in these cases, was covering for a different ancestor entirely, one whose actual identity the family had decided, generations ago, was too dangerous to name. This is not a comfortable finding. It doesn't make the families villains. Most of the people alive today who carry these stories had no part in constructing them. They inherited them the same way they inherited their eye color. But understanding where the story came from, understanding the fear and the calculation that created it, matters. Because it means the legend is not just a genealogical error, it is a historical artifact, a record of what it cost, in a certain time and place, to have the wrong ancestor. The second theory is gentler, and it probably explains more of the 70 million than the first one does. It goes like this. The American Southeast in the 18th and 19th centuries was not Cherokee territory exclusively. It was home to dozens of Native American nations: the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee Creek, the Catawba, the Powhatan, the Lumbee. Dozens of smaller groups whose names have mostly disappeared from popular memory. These nations intermarried with European settlers. They traded with them, they fought alongside them, they adopted children, they were adopted into. The mixing was real, and it was widespread. Genealogists and historians have documented it extensively. But here is what happened over generations. When a mixed-race child was born in 1780 or 1810 or 1840, and that child grew up knowing one grandparent was indigenous, the specific tribal affiliation of that grandparent was often lost within a generation or two. The language was lost. The ceremonies were lost. The specific community connection was broken by removal, by displacement, by death, by assimilation. What remained was a general sense. There was indigenous ancestry. Somewhere back there, someone who was native. And when families tried to name that ancestor, when they tried to attach a specific identity to a general memory, they reached for the most famous name they knew, the tribe everyone had heard of, the tribe that had been in every newspaper, every political speech, every school book for 100 years. Cherokee. The ancestor was real. The indigenous blood was real. The mixing actually happened. But the specific tribal name got replaced, over generations, by the one name that everyone recognized, the one that filled the blank most naturally. This theory has enormous implications for how we think about Native American genealogy in America. It suggests that millions of Americans may have real indigenous ancestry, just not Cherokee ancestry specifically. They are descended from nations that history made less famous, nations whose names were harder to hold on to, nations who got erased twice, once by displacement and death, and again by being replaced in family memory by a more famous tribe's name. If this theory is correct, the Cherokee princess legend is not entirely a fiction. It is a true story with the wrong name attached to it. The third theory comes from a place that none of the family storytellers, none of the genealogy websites, and none of the consumer DNA companies ever anticipated. It comes from ancient DNA, from bones, from burials that are thousands of years old. In 2012, a study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics identified what researchers called the ghost population problem. Here is what that means. When geneticists map human ancestry, they work by comparing living people's DNA against reference populations, groups whose genetic history is considered relatively stable and well documented. You take someone's DNA, you compare it against the reference panel, and the algorithm tells you what percentage of your ancestry came from which population. But the models kept finding signal that didn't match, genetic material that didn't fit any known reference population cleanly. A ghost. Something old and unaccounted for, showing up in the data but not matching any group the models were built to recognize. And when researchers began recovering ancient DNA from North American burial sites, bones that are 2,000, 5,000, 8,000 years old, they found genetic profiles that don't appear in living populations the way the original models predicted. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event, not one migration across the Bering Land Bridge, spreading south and populating 2 continents. The genetic record shows multiple waves, multiple founding populations, multiple groups that mixed and separated and disappeared and left traces in ways that the standard story does not account for. A landmark 2020 paper in the journal Cell used ancient DNA from burial sites across North and South America to show that the genetic history of the Americas is dramatically more complex than anyone had assumed. There were populations that contributed to both indigenous Americans and to some European populations through pathways that predate the groups we now recognize as separate. Ancient connections, deep time entanglements, ancestry that is so old it predates the categories of Cherokee and European and African that we use today. What this means, carefully stated, because this is genuinely active science with genuine uncertainty, is that some of the signal Americans are reading as Cherokee or Native American ancestry in their consumer DNA tests may in fact be something far older. Traces of populations that contributed to multiple branches of humanity. Ancestry that exists in unexpected places because it is ancient enough to predate the divergence of the groups we now think of as distinct. The Cherokee princess may not be in the data because she was never the right frame. The real ancestor may be something older than any tribe, something that the consumer DNA test was never designed to find because the reference panels were never built to look for it. This is not fringe science. It is peer-reviewed, actively debated, and rapidly evolving. And it suggests that the 70 million Americans reaching for Cherokee ancestry may be pointing, clumsily, romantically, inaccurately, at something real, just something older and stranger and more complicated than a great-great-grandmother with high cheekbones and a name nobody can quite remember. So now you have three theories: a story built to hide a dangerous ancestor, a true story with the wrong tribal name attached, and an ancient genetic signal that consumer science was never built to detect. Each one explains part of the 70 million. Each one points toward a different piece of American history, and all three of them together produce the same conclusion. The legend is not random. It is not simply error. It is doing something. It is carrying something. It is a signal, even when it is pointing in the wrong direction. Everything we have talked about so far lives in the world of genetics. Migration patterns, haplogroups, reference panels, ancient DNA recovered from bones that are older than any nation currently on the map. Three theories, each one pointing at a different piece of the puzzle. But here is the thing about genetics. Genetics can tell you where your ancestors were standing 10,000 years ago. It can trace the movement of populations across continents. It can find relatives you didn't know you had. It can overturn family legends and confirm others. What it cannot do is tell you who you are. And that distinction between where your ancestors came from and who you actually are is exactly where the Cherokee Nation has been standing for decades, waiting patiently for mainstream America to catch up. The Cherokee Nation does not use DNA to determine citizenship. Read that sentence again, because it is the single most important fact in this entire conversation. The single fact that most of the 70 million people who took a consumer DNA test completely missed. The Cherokee Nation bases citizenship on documented lineal descent from individuals listed on the Dawes rolls. That is the standard. That is the definition. Not a percentage in a database, not a result from a tube of spit mailed to a laboratory in California. A documented, traceable, verifiable line of descent from a specific historical record. The Dawes rolls are a federal census of Cherokee citizens conducted between 1898 and 1914. They were created as part of the allotment process when the United States government was dissolving the communal land holdings of the 5 civilized tribes and converting them into individual parcels that could be bought and sold. The rolls listed every enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation, the Delaware, and the freedmen, the freed enslaved people who had been held by Cherokee slaveholders and who were later granted citizenship by treaty. The rolls are not perfect. They were created by a government with its own interests. Some people were excluded. Some were listed incorrectly. The process was coercive and the context was colonial. All of that is true, but they are the record. And the Cherokee Nation, exercising its sovereign right to define its own membership, has chosen that record as the foundation of citizenship. Not genetics, not appearance, not family legend. A documented line from a specific historical document. Chuck Hoskin Jr., the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, has spoken about this publicly and clearly for years. The message does not change. What makes someone Cherokee is not a percentage of DNA. It is community. It is language. It is law. It is the relationship between a people and their government. It is participation in a living culture that has survived removal, allotment, assimilation campaigns, boarding schools, and every other attempt to erase it. A genetic result, even a positive one, even one that shows genuine indigenous American ancestry, does not make someone Cherokee. And the absence of a DNA result does not mean someone's family history is false, or that their connection to indigenous people is imaginary. What it means is that the framework most Americans have been using to approach this question is simply the wrong framework. It was always the wrong framework. And the DNA testing boom of the 2010s did not correct that error. In many ways, it made it worse. Here is why. When tens of millions of Americans sent their DNA to consumer testing companies, many of them were hoping for confirmation. They wanted the test to validate the family story, to say, yes, the Cherokee blood is real, it is in you, it belongs to you. And when the test came back negative, when the Cherokee Ancestry didn't appear in the results, many of those same people did not conclude that the family story was wrong. They concluded that the test was incomplete, that the ancestry was there but the test wasn't sensitive enough to find it, that the Cherokee great-great-grandmother existed, she just wasn't showing up in the data yet. This is a revealing response. because it shows that for many people, the DNA test was never really the point. The test was sought as confirmation of a belief that was already fixed. When the confirmation didn't come, the belief remained. The test was disposable. The story was not. And that tells you something important. The Cherokee princess legend is not primarily a genealogical claim. It is an identity claim. It is a statement about who someone is and where they belong, and what their connection to this land means. And identity claims are not resolved by laboratory results. The Cherokee Nation understands this. That is exactly why their citizenship standard is not genetic, because they know that identity is not a blood percentage. It is a relationship. It is a history. It is a set of obligations and a set of rights that exist within a community and a government and a culture. The millions of Americans who want Cherokee ancestry want something the DNA test was never equipped to give them, and they are looking for it in a place it was never stored. Now let's talk about what is actually being lost in this conversation, because there is a cost to the legend, and it is not paid by the people who carry it. It is paid by the people whose actual identity keeps getting turned into someone else's ancestry story. The Cherokee people were not destroyed by the Trail of Tears. This needs to be said plainly, because the myth of vanishing indigenous peoples is part of what made the legend possible in the first place. The Cherokee were not absorbed into the American population and dissolved into romance. They survived. The Cherokee Nation is a functioning sovereign government headquartered in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. It has its own legislature, its own court system, its own executive branch. It provides healthcare, education, housing, and social services to its citizens. It negotiates with the federal government as a sovereign entity. It is not a historical relic. It is a living government. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians maintains the ancestral homeland in the mountains of western North Carolina. Their reservation, the Qualla Boundary, has been continuously inhabited by Cherokee people since before European contact. They maintain their own government, their own cultural institutions, their own language programs. Their ancestors hid in those mountains during the removal. They never left. The United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma continues the ceremonial and cultural traditions that predate contact. Their focus is on the preservation of the oldest Cherokee spiritual and cultural practices. 3 separate sovereign nations, hundreds of thousands of enrolled citizens, a living language being actively taught to children, a government that predates the United States Constitution and has outlasted every attempt to eliminate it. These are real people with a real present, not just a romantic past. And when millions of Americans claim Cherokee ancestry without connection to any of this, without knowledge of the language, without relationship to the community, without enrollment, without accountability to the actual nation, it is not a neutral act. It is at minimum a distraction. It floods genealogy databases and ancestry forums with fictional Cherokee ancestors, making it harder for actual descendants to trace real family lines. It dilutes conversations about indigenous rights and sovereignty with people whose connection to the topic is a family story that genetics has already called into question. It treats Cherokee identity as a costume that can be put on with a DNA test and taken off when inconvenient. The enrolled Cherokee citizens who live with this every day, who watch their nation's name attached to casinos they have no connection to people claiming status they have no basis for, to a romantic myth that was built on the assumption that their people had disappeared. They have every reason to find it exhausting. So where does that leave the 70 million? Here is the answer that the research actually supports, when you follow it past the consumer product and into the peer-reviewed literature. The genetic history of the Americas is genuinely ancient, genuinely complex, and genuinely still being written. Ancient DNA analysis is recovering profiles from burials every year that revise the migration models. The founding populations of this continent were not a single group. They were multiple waves, carrying different genetics, mixing in different places, disappearing in some regions and persisting in others. Some of that ancient lineage exists in living populations in ways that standard consumer tests are not equipped to detect. At the same time, the documentary record is clear. The Dawes rolls, the census records, the land allotment files, the tribal citizenship rolls, These documents trace real Cherokee people
never
whose
seen anything
descendants
like
are
it.
identifiable, whose history is documented, whose citizenship is defined by their own sovereign nation. Between those two things, the ancient genetics and the political reality, sits the family story. And the family story, for all its inaccuracies, for all the ways it fails the historical and genetic record, is doing something real. It is carrying a longing, a need, a very human impulse to belong to something older than the family photo album. To say, we have roots in this land. We are not just here since last century or the century before. We are connected to something that goes back further than the ordinary documentary record reaches. That longing is human. That longing is real. But there is a difference between acknowledging a longing and acting on it at someone else's expense. There is a difference between saying, I feel drawn to this history, and saying, this history belongs to me. There is a difference between curiosity and appropriation. Before we get to what you can actually do with all of this, there is something concrete and specific you can do, something most people watching this have never tried. If you have spent any time on genealogy websites, in ancestry forums, in family history groups, you know that the Cherokee princess story is everywhere. You have seen it. You may have grown up with it, you may be carrying it right now, and you probably have never had access to a clear, practical guide to what the actual records show and how to check them. That is exactly what we put together. A step-by-step breakdown of how to search the Dawes rolls yourself for free using publicly available databases. How to read a census record, how to trace a family line through the actual documentary record that the Cherokee Nation uses. Not a consumer algorithm, not a reference panel, but the historical documents that determine real citizenship. It is free, it is specific, it works. The link is in the description below. But that is only one part of what you actually need to do this properly. The full system, the one that covers not just the Dawes rolls, but the earlier records, the removal era documents, the pre-contact genealogies, that is all in one place. Link is in the description. Go check it. But stay with me, because what comes next is the part of this story that almost nobody talks about. And it is the most important part. Here is what DNA can tell you. And here is what it cannot. DNA can tell you that your ancestors, 10,000 years ago, were standing in a particular part of the world. It can tell you that migrations happened, that populations mixed, that the boundaries we draw between groups today are younger than the ancestry that flows across them. What DNA cannot tell you is what you owe to the living, what you owe to the actual people whose history you are reaching toward, what you owe to a sovereign nation that has survived everything this country threw at it and is still here, still governing, still teaching its language to children who will teach it to their children. The Cherokee princess legend is not usually a lie. It is a story that millions of American families have used to locate themselves in a history they sense is there, but cannot quite reach. It is a way of claiming roots, of saying, we belong here, we have always been here. The land is in us somehow. That longing is human. That longing is real. But the Cherokee people are also real, and they are not a legend. They are not a story someone else gets to claim. They are a nation. And they have been here the whole time. Write your answer in the comments right now. Which of the three theories hit you hardest? Number 1, the story built to hide a dangerous ancestor. Number 2, the real ancestry with the wrong tribal name. Number 3, the ancient DNA that predates every category we use today. Write the number. I want to know which one stopped you cold. And if you know someone who grew up with the Cherokee princess story in their family, forward this to them. One share could be the thing that finally gives them a real answer instead of a legend. And it might give them something more valuable than a DNA result. An honest conversation about what the story was actually doing all along. Next week, we go somewhere even more uncomfortable. I have been looking at a 1994 internal memo from one of the largest genealogy database companies in the world. A document that shows their research team knew, and I mean specifically knew, that their indigenous American ancestry classifications were producing false positives at a rate they considered acceptable. They buried the finding. The memo exists. I have it. Next week we look at it together. You do not want to miss that one.